Happy New Year, and welcome to episode 15 of the Chat It Up podcast. I'm your host, Shooter, and I have to say it is crazy to think that we are already 15 episodes into the podcast, and it's even crazier to think that it's about to be 2019. But, that being said, I have a special episode for you guys today. For all of you loyal listeners, it's definitely going to be way different than anything you're used to hearing from the podcast. I'm not interviewing anybody. I'm not chatting with anyone. I'm not sitting down with anyone. Unless you count me sitting here with my dog Toast at my feet. So shout out to my buddy Toast. But yeah, I'm just sitting here on my couch by myself. And that's intentional though. Because I knew with this episode coming out on New Year's Eve, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So what I did is I put out there on social media that people could ask me any questions that they wanted to about the podcast, and I would go through and answer them. So I'm going to go through, I got a handful of some pretty good questions, so I'll answer each and every one of them. From there, I'll probably talk a little bit about what you can expect from the podcast in 2019. And then, of course, at the end, I will go through my takeaways for 2018 because, as all you faithful listeners know, I can't go through an episode without having some takeaways at the end. So, without further ado, I guess I can chat it up here. So, my first question is on Twitter, and it comes from the Twitter handle SuperfanDanUP. So, his actually, before I get into his question, I want to give Dan a shout out. Dan, a few years ago, had a podcast called UP the Podcast. It focused a lot on the music scene in the UP and a few local authors, but was definitely kind of a precursor, if you will, to what I've been doing here with Chat It Up. So I just want to give credit where credit is due and give Dan a little bit of a shout out there. But his question is, would you consider doing an episode where you talk to a group of elders about what it was like growing up in the UP 60 to 80 years ago? What they did for fun on Friday nights, etc., and how their hometown has changed, be it Iron Mountain, Marquette, Escanaba, etc. So, first of all, Dan, great question. To answer it, yes, I would definitely be interested in doing an episode like that. I'm a huge history buff. In fact, in college, my minor was social studies, so history is something that has always been of interest to me. I love sitting down and chatting with my father. I mean, he's only in his 60s, but even my grandmother, she's 90. I love chatting with her about the way things used to be back in the old days. So definitely an episode that I would consider. In that kind of same vein, I'd gotten a message on Facebook from a Jared Hauhe, or Hahi. I'm sorry, Jared, if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong or if I'm slaughtering it. Jared had just asked me if I would be interested in possibly doing an episode on a project he and some other Yoopers are working on. And again, my answer is yes. Long story short, I'd be interested, or I'm willing to consider any episode or suggestion that people might have for me about a person or a project or an event or something cool that's going on in the UP. Really, my only requirements are it has to be somehow tied into the UP, and as long as I can get at least a half hour of content out of it, as most of you listeners know, usually my episodes are closer to an hour. That's really ideal. But at the bare minimum, as long as it's tied into the UP and I can get at least a half hour worth of content out of it, I'll certainly consider doing an episode on it. Now that being said, before I ever put a podcast episode out, I sat down and I made a list on a sheet of paper of, if I could sit down and interview any Yoopers, who would I want to talk to and why? And I came up with probably 3 or 4 pages worth of people. Now, that being said, that's not the end-all, be-all of where I want this podcast to go. But if, the suggestions that people might have fit into that, then so be it. I'll most certainly consider doing episodes on that. So, all of that being said, if you've got an idea for an episode, reach out to me. Whether it be on the Facebook page, the Twitter page, or the Instagram page, slide into my DMs, as the kids say these days. Or you can always shoot me an email. The email address for the podcast is chatituppod@gmail.com. So drop me a line, give me a suggestion, and I'll most certainly consider having it as an episode. So thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jared, for both of those questions. My next question comes from my buddy Aaron Yunker, also affectionately known as Uncle Pizza. Aaron is one of the guys behind the short film Waiting for Wig that was filmed here in the Negaunee-Ishpeming area. You've probably heard me mention Waiting for Wig a handful of times on the podcast, so shout out to Uncle Pizza. His question is an awesome question, and it's actually one that I get quite often, and that's, what do I use to record my podcast, which I actually have a pretty streamlined setup. If I'm bebopping all over the UP, I need to have as little equipment with me as possible. So I'll kind of walk through each of the different pieces of equipment that I have. It's really simple. I record everything on my iPhone, which is just an iPhone 7. I have an awesome app that I got on the App Store that's called Voice Record. It's a free app, and it's hands down the most user-friendly voice or audio recording app that I've found. There's no limit to how long your recording can be. You can record in a handful of different file formats if you're particular on that. It's super easy to upload it to the cloud or to your Google Drive or however you wanna do that. So again, the app is called Voice Record. I do use a microphone. That would probably be the golden rule, I would say, if you're thinking of starting a podcast. Get yourself a good mic, and the nice thing is thankfully because of Amazon, decent mics aren't all that expensive. The mic that I have is a lapel mic system, so you can clip it right on your shirt. It's from a company called Movo, M-O-V-O, and I believe mine's called the Executive clip-on microphone system. So it's two microphones that kind of clip into one thing that plugs right into my iPhone. So it's pretty slick, and I really like being able to be hands-free. I found very early on with doing my interviews, if somebody's got to hold a microphone or hold something, they don't act or talk as naturally as they normally would. Let's be honest, most of us talk with our hands and we're very expressive, so having the clip-on microphones is really great, because once you kind of start talking with somebody, you really forget it's there and you just have a normal conversation as opposed to a more rigid interview, so to speak. Other than that, the only other piece of equipment that I use is I have my Amazon Fire tablet, and really I just have my notes for each interview on that tablet. Obviously I do some homework before each interview of questions that I want to ask people, and really the tablet just kind of keeps me on task throughout the conversation to make sure I don't forget any of those questions. From there, once I finish doing my interview, I usually listen to it a couple of times through, and from there I'll record my intro and my outro just to make sure that then I kind of hit on the points that I want to make. And then I upload everything to my Google Drive, and then I hop on my laptop. And on my laptop I have a program called Audacity, which is probably the most well-known audio editing program out there. Again, it's very user-friendly and straightforward. And I just kind of throw everything in there and put the episode together and export it as an MP3 and upload it then to Buzzsprout, which is the company that hosts my podcast. Another kind of spin-off question from Aaron's is not one that somebody asked me on social media, but it is a question that I get quite often, and that's about the theme music for the podcast. A lot of people want to know where it came from, who created it, if it's royalty free, all of that good stuff. And believe it or not, yours truly created the theme music for the Chat It Up podcast. I created it in GarageBand, which is the Apple's music app. So I have GarageBand on my phone, and I have to give a shout out to Jeff Harry, because you've heard me probably shout him out a couple of times on the podcast here. In one of his classes, I was able to get very familiar with the GarageBand program. So it was super easy for me to kind of put that theme music together, and people seem to really enjoy it. So again, great question, Aaron. Thank you for sending it my way. The next question I have is actually an email, and I will only use the person's first name because I don't want to give away their identity or anything like that. His name is Kevin, and the email says, "Hey Shooter, big fan of the podcast. Have you ever considered doing any advertising on it? If so, let me know because I may be interested in, well, yada yada." Like I said, I'll stop the email there because I don't want to give away his identity. But to answer his question, yes, I have considered doing advertising on the podcast, and I'm open to the idea. I've actually had a couple of conversations recently about doing some advertising on the podcast. My big thing is I don't want it to be too awkward or take away from the podcast. I would never do anything in the middle, like when I'm interviewing or talking with somebody. It would probably have to be either at the beginning or the end of the podcast. But I'm certainly open to the idea. So if you are interested in doing any advertising on the podcast like Kevin, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Again, you can email me at chatituppod@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on social media. But great question, Kevin. The last question comes from my wonderful, amazing, beautiful girlfriend, Patricia. So Patty reached out on the Facebook page, and she asked the question of, what has been the most fun part of doing the podcast this year? Which is actually a great question, but it's also kind of a tough question because pretty much all of it has been fun doing the podcast this year. I mean, this is just a hobby of mine. If I wasn't having fun, I probably wouldn't be doing it. But I'd have to say probably the most fun part of doing the podcast is really probably just getting to know people. Quite a few of the people I interviewed this year I had never met before in my life. And so it was really cool and interesting to actually just kind of sit down and get to know some of these people. And now I can kind of say I feel like I'm friends with them. So that was super cool. And even actually, the other half of the people that I interviewed were people that I already knew or people that I considered friends. But through the interviews, I actually got to know them better and learn some things about them that I never ever knew. So I guess you could just blanket that statement and say just getting to know people in general was probably the most fun part for me for doing the podcast over the last 5 or 6 months. So great question, Patty, and actually great question to everybody. So thank you again to all of you that reached out and responded. So that being said, I can kind of probably transition into what you can expect from the podcast in 2019 and moving forward. First thing is I definitely want to continue traveling around the UP. I went from St. Agnes to Ironwood and in between this year. Allison from That Which Nourishes, she's from the Keweenaw area, but I'd like to get up to Houghton and Hancock and maybe get a few stories out of there. So I've got some things in the works there, hopefully. I'd like to possibly add a few new segments to the podcast as well. I know I always do my pasty question at the end of every interview. So I'll probably update the pasty poll pretty soon. So keep your eyes peeled on social media for that because I haven't updated that in a while. So I'll probably continue doing the pasty poll, but I may add another segment or two to the mix just to kind of keep things interesting. That being said, you could probably just expect a lot more of the same from me in the podcast through 2019. Hopefully I'll continue to be putting out episodes every 2 weeks. And that's pretty much it. I've got some other kind of cool stuff hopefully in the works, but I don't really want to talk about it because if I'm just being honest, I don't want to jinx it. But hopefully I can make a few things work and I can put out a couple of, or I should say continue to put out some great content for you guys. Other than that, I guess I can go to my takeaways for 2018. So my first takeaway from 2018 is one thing that I've learned about myself from this podcast is how much more I truly learn and absorb when I just sit back and shut up and listen. My entire life I've been a talker. Ask anybody that knows me, and they'll say that I could have a conversation with anyone about anything, and I've just always been that way. I've got the gift of gab. So this podcast has definitely taught me the value of shutting up, sitting back, and just really truly absorbing what someone's about and what they have to say. And it's been a valuable for me. I've really kind of learned to appreciate that. My second big takeaway from 2018 is, I'm going to use a Yooper term right now. I'm going to say, holy wah, is a lot of stuff going on around the UP. Between the people that I've interviewed and the messages that I've gotten from people of stuff going on, it's unbelievable the amount of just cool things that are going on and the stuff that people are up to around the Upper Peninsula. And really that kind of feeds into my final takeaway for 2018, and that's something that I've said multiple times on this podcast, and it's something that I've known for years, and that's just that the UP is just full of incredible people. And it didn't take this podcast for me to realize that. It just really kind of reiterated that, if anything else. But between the people that I've interviewed and the people I came across in my travels, it's just unbelievable, the character and the quality of the people that we have throughout the Upper Peninsula. And I hope that this podcast can just kind of continue to shine a light on that. Obviously, social media and the internet, there are some negatives to it, and a lot of times you hear the negatives that are associated with those things, but I hope that this podcast can continue to shine light on the positive side of social media and the internet, and by that I mean shining a light on what connects us and brings us all together, and shining that light all the way across the UP, because it's easy for us to kind of see what's going on a day-to-day basis around our own communities and the people that we call friends and family and neighbors and coworkers, but it's not always necessarily easy to cast that bigger net and see the bigger picture and see all of the incredible stuff that's going on, across the region. So if anything, I really just hope that this podcast brings a smile to your face and is a bright spot in your day and can continue to kind of shine that spotlight on this incredible and amazing place that we call home, because I truly think that it is one of the most beautiful and special and unique places in the country, if not the entire world. So other than that, I think I've pretty much hit on everything that I wanted to talk about here in this episode. I know it's kind of short but sweet, so I'm going to just end it there. So thank you to everybody that has listened in and sent me a message and passed along kind words. It means more to me than you'll ever know, and I hope that you'll continue to kind of stick with me and grow with me, and hopefully we can continue to take this podcast as far as I can take it, and see where things go. So I hope you all have a happy, healthy, and prosperous 2019. So Happy New Year, and as always, keep your chin up and your eyes forward.